Life for black Americans in the 1930s in America was incredibly difficult, and it was made more difficult by the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were a series of laws that segregated black from white in a number of different areas. If you're not sure what segregated means, it means separated. It means kept apart. So the Jim Crow laws were all about keeping blacks separate from whites, and in lots of different areas. So, for example, you had education, you had work, you had transport, you had schools, you had all lots and lots of different areas. And there were actually different laws across states, although you have to say that the Jim Crow laws were applied most harshly in southern states. And perhaps, to be honest, the most famous president who enforced them was Woodrow Wilson, from 1912 onwards, who, whose government was very much behind the idea of the Jim Crow laws, and he promoted the Jim Crow laws and the introduction of more of these laws. And certainly in the 1930s, these laws still existed, and they prevented black people also from having the vote through literacy tests. So I'll just put that as a separate point, really. One of the biggest focal points here was restricting black rights. It wasn't just separating black people from white people, it was making sure that black people never got into a position where they could actually influence the country. And a big way that they could do that was by putting a black president in charge. And there was probably enough black people, if they all voted, to actually make that happen. The white supremacists knew that. So what they did is they introduced literacy tests, which basically blocked black people from voting because black people could not read or write, the majority. So it was a very clever way to actually prevent them from influencing the country. They knew they couldn't read or write. They knew their literacy levels were incredibly low, but they also knew that by law, everybody in the United States Constitution should be able to vote. So they introduced these literacy tests to stop black people from doing that, and it worked. The vast majority of black people were not able to take part in elections, certainly nowhere near the amount they would need to actually influence things. So you had the Jim Crow laws, particularly in the South of the United States, but you also had a group known as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan. They were a white supremacist organization. So they believed that white people were naturally supreme to black people. And they were willing to enforce this view, and they would enforce it in a number of different ways. Their methods included tarring and feathering black people, and quite often this was at random. Tarring and feathering. This would be pouring boiling hot tar over a half-naked man and attaching feathers to him, often from a chicken. It was a pure act of humiliation, but obviously incredibly painful as well for the victim. They would whip black people in public. They would execute black people, and their favourite method of doing this was lynching black people. They would lynch them, and of course you may have seen the Ku Klux Klan wearing their white robes and masks and garments, and they were very much disguised. You didn't know their identity, and I suppose for a black person living in the South, that made them all the more powerful. In fact, in the early 1920s, I know that's before perhaps the period we're looking at, they had about 5 million members. By 1925, that had dropped to under 1 million, but nevertheless, in the 1930s, they are still an incredibly powerful organization. And of course, they would, people that they would threaten, they would burn giant crosses in their back garden to kind of mark the territory and say, you're under threat from us, unless you stop whatever it is you're doing. In fact, that would quite often be used against white people as well, the burning cross in the back garden, you'd wake up and suddenly pull back the curtains and there it was. So they were an incredibly scary organisation. And that, coupled with the Jim Crow laws, led black people to actually leave the South, where these two things were really in greatest effect. And so many left, in fact, it was about 5 million black people who left, that it was called the Great Migration. And it was this kind of exodus, I would call it, this exodus of black people travelling from the South to the North. Now, travelling from somewhere like Alabama up north, it didn't guarantee anything. It didn't guarantee that you would be safe and that things would be better. But certainly, there was no KKK. There was a very slim chance you were going to get lynched. You were going to get executed. The Jim Crow laws were mostly not in effect. What you did find in the North was discrimination in work. You still found, prejudice in the street. Discrimination. You still found discrimination and prejudice in the street regularly. There was still, an awful lot of racism that existed even in the north of the USA. So it wasn't really the answer for these 5 million black people who decided to leave their homes and travel north. It was far from the answer. But ultimately, they thought that it was better. And for most of them, it probably was. There was a few bright lights for, shall we call them, or positive things for black people in this whole kind of mess. And that was the setting up of the organisation called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. Their main campaign was to get that vote. So it was all linked to the literacy tests and getting rid of those literacy tests, because that's what they thought was the key to all of this. Enfranchise black people, give them the right to vote, and actually we can change things from the inside. And their major campaign was to get black people to vote. And they were growing in the 1930s. In fact, in the 1940s, which we'll come on to, they grew even more significantly. But they did give black people kind of hope in this situation. And there was also another group that was the Back to Africa group, otherwise known as the UNIA. And as you can tell, their main thing was that black people should completely reject the United States and actually sail on boats and go back to Africa and start a new life there. Obviously, it was completely unrealistic for the vast majority of black people. A, they didn't have the money to do it. And B, they'd settled in the USA. They didn't want to leave what they considered to be their home. The other, I suppose, the only other bright light for black people was Roosevelt's New Deal. In the 1930s, obviously, he set up the New Deal. There was a lot of alphabet agencies, and a lot of them actually did help the poorest people. And of course, the poorest people, in a lot of cases, happened to be black people. All in all, the 1930s was not a very good time to be a black American. And what we're going to do in future videos is look at how this situation that we're looking at on screen now actually changed.